Hi everyone, this is Eli. Welcome back to Elfbait. So today I want to take a look at kind of populating your world with hooks and locations that can help lead into adventures. So one of the things, when I'm talking to folks or looking around on the forums, a lot of people who are starting out as DMs are wondering, how do you create interesting locations? How do you have interesting, adventures planned? And a lot of this comes down to good prep work. So none of us started out with a natural gift of creating adventures, and certainly it is something that you get better at over time. But there are some basics that I think have been touched on before, and a lot of times they're looking at these very formulaic ways of creating encounters. I'm not so much looking at encounters right now, but more just like locations or adventure ideas, seeds, or actually just really a good way to come up with interesting places for people to want to go to. So whether you're running a very dungeon crawly campaign or an open world setting, this still helps. This is still going to help because dungeon crawls, usually, from dungeon to dungeon, not a lot of in between downtime, actual gaming time. A lot of the downtime there is handled very mechanically, just equipment updates, charts, and stuff like that. But the dungeons are still going to be there, and so this what I'm going to talk about here is not specifically for dungeons. Dungeon being the very broad sense. Whether it's out in the woods or in an open, or whether it's a social game or a dungeon crawl, monster kill kind of a thing, murder hobo type of thing. It all fits. So it just comes down to the locations and the hooks that you're using. So it pays to, first things first, find a place to put your ideas. I do this one of two ways. I use Google Drive because I can access that from any computer I have access to. But I also keep a DM's journal. DM's journal is just a book I went out and got that. I prefer a DM's journal with grid on the pages because I can write text and do maps pretty easily on those pages. Now, a lot of people swear by blank pages. Apologize for the heater noise in the background. It's very cold in the garage this morning, and it's kind of hard not to have that thing on. So, but yes, DM's journals are great because you can have that with you wherever you go, even if you don't have computer access. Now, some might argue, I've got my phone or my tablet with me. Still find it hard sometimes to access or to update Google Drive documents or other, whether it's Dropbox or whatever, other stored documents on a mobile device, simply because the interface is a little wonky and it doesn't work quite as well as for my laptop or a desktop or something. So, but with your journals, you can keep anything that comes to mind there. The nice thing about a journal is you got an idea for a map, you doodle it down. Got an idea for an encounter, you write it down. Really cool NPC, you write it down. I find that the stuff that I put in my journal is the stuff that I'm going to need more table ready, the things, the smaller ideas, the spot ideas. The Drive documents and stuff, that's actually more where I put the hard framework stuff. Often stuff from the journal will get fleshed out on the Drive. So first of all, a place to store your stuff. Journals are great. This can be anything from a spiral bound notebook, little flip books that you get, to a composition book, dedicated journals. Like I said, there's the one I have. It's like 600 pages of small grid, small light colored grid. So it's really useful and really versatile. It's a little overkill. It's like that thick, and I could probably bean somebody with it. But so place to put your stuff. Now, the two most important things I find for designing adventures, and these are the things that often get people hung up the most. I mean, encounter development and all of that, and the fiddly bits. Once you have an idea for what your adventure is, where it's going to be, what it's about, the rest of that stuff will fall in place with a little bit of tinkering and thought. So two parts to any good adventure. Primarily is the location, and the location is more important to me than the hook, because hooks can change depending on where you are in the game, but the location is the meat and the bones of that adventure. So what I like to do, and actually I was just working on this morning, which kind of prompted me to make this video, because I just do this unconsciously, but I was talking to somebody about it, and it popped into my head. I had a couple of good examples today, so video. And this is one of the other secrets to, good DMs, is these GMs that you hear about or you play with that make it look so easy. It's turned into rote and autopilot for them. It's not a matter of sitting down at a table one day and going, I'm going to design a great adventure. It's constantly churning this information out to the point where you are having coffee, you see a couple of words that sparks an adventure, or at least a location or a hook. The other day at work, we were commenting that street names and town names that we were running into in our job really made for good town, or even sometimes character name ideas for D&D. So you're gonna get this inspiration from everywhere. It's a matter of turning it into useful tidbits that you can put together for adventures. So a location, really, I find that when I'm doing a location, I don't like to simply go library. To me, library doesn't jog the memory when I come back to it later. Library, while it can spark some ideas, and it's not bad to have generic stuff or to think that way, but if you can add something to embellish that gives it some life and some flavor, you will certainly have a better time turning that into an adventure later on, because that's what we're doing. We're laying down foundation work that you can build on later on, and often when you're coming back to it, that original spark of inspiration may not be there. So a name, instead of going with library, bridge, keep, the library of such and such, give it a name, give it some adjectives, the golden library. So this morning, I was doing a couple of just brainstorming. I have and I came up with the Tower of Kossus, and a comment my wife made on their way out the door led to, the Dread Hive of Azkaban. Now these sound nonsensical, and they may not make a lot of sense, but these are giving in their names some sort of a character that you can build off of later. Little point on inspiration: the Dread Hive of Azkaban came about because my wife, who has dreadlocks, got her hair caught in some of her Halloween decorations this morning, and when she's at work, to keep them out of the way, she piles them up on her head, and it looks like kind of an old beehive hairdo, and she called it her Dread Beehive, and so now we have the Dread Hive of Azkaban. So locations are good. Certainly when you're building locations, you want to go ahead and give it, think of what the location is, but giving it a name. And then what I like to do is do like 2 or 3 sentences just that tell me in the moment what I think this place is. So in this case, the Tower of Kossus is this mythic tower from a bygone age that has several distinct levels inside it that are each an open floor suspended by chains, which also work as bridges from an outer staircase that goes up the entirety of the tower. Now that alone could be a great feature, but as I was writing it up, I also decided that each of these levels has a very specific guardian, and so that up through the tower. Now, who Kossus or what Kossus is not developed in that. What it means to the world isn't wholly developed. I have some ideas because I jotted this down, and I'm in a current campaign where I'm running a campaign where I have a very layered world. So there's certainly levels of history that I can draw back with, and that's another thing I'll talk about later on in the video. So, Tower of Kossus is that the Dread Hive of Azkaban. What is that? Well, that could be anything from an actual hive of creatures. It could be a demon hive. In my case, I decided that it was a sorcerer's. It was a sorcerer's fortress in a cave system that was sealed away in ancient times, but he was known for having dealing with magics and developing all sorts of insectoid monstrosities. So it kind of gets back to that sort of crazy giant bug, creepy crawly magics and stuff like that. So coming up with a name that is not just a name of a location. I mean, laundry lists of locations are easy to do. What we're looking for here is an inspiring location. I had another one that came up with is the Valley of the Ivory Princess. So Valley of the Ivory Princess, what is that? Well, I decided that in ancient times there was a particular merchant, merchant stronghold, a merchant hub that was ruled by a woman they called the Ivory Princess, and she was renowned for not only her acumen in trading and mercantile pursuits, but also for being particularly nasty in life until that nastiness brought her to an end. And now, supposedly, but legend has it that there's this valley where her riches are still there. So we're looking for a lot of times when you're doing these locations, you want to work in reasons that players and their characters may want to go there. The Tower of Kossus doesn't state that specifically, but it stands to reason that if you have this big tower with all this effort put in there with guardians, there's probably something there. And that'll go back to another tidbit. This will loop back onto hooks in a minute. Now, the Valley of the Ivory Princess, that has hooks built into it just by having legend of a treasure hoard, but there could be more there. And then, of course, the Dread Hive of Azkaban. That, who knows? What is the reason for going there? And these are just three that I came up with this morning. So these are things. This is laying down a name with some kind of flavor to it that evokes something. You don't have to write as much information in there, and certainly just a couple of sentences. Valley of the Ivory Princess could simply have been notated as ancient merchant hub, treasure hoard. Something to give you a frame of reference when you come back. Now, even if you had all of that other stuff I said about the Valley of the Ivory Princess fixed in your head, just jotting down those two things plus the name may be enough to bring it back when you're looking at it, months down the road when you're looking to build a new adventure. So don't be afraid to just play with goofy names. The nice thing about odd names like Kossus and Azkaban, these evoke to the players a more ancient time. Very often, especially if you're playing the standard D&D kind of medieval concept, the idea is that things are a certain way now in the campaign world, but when you use names that are odd from the rest of the naming conventions in the day-to-day of the game, it's going to get the players wondering, Azkaban, that's a pretty crazy name. What is he? Who is he? Kossus, Tower of Kossus, that sounds foreboding and worth checking out. So these things will evoke history for the game. So you're actually accomplishing another element too when you're giving these things interesting names. Even if you're not developing a full backstory for them, you're infusing history and the layers of background to your world that make it seem more full and rich and alive. But going kind of back to nonsense names have a tendency to do that, and they're not really nonsense. I mean, Azkaban is very kind of almost Mesopotamian, Sumerian. Kossus is very Greek sounding. So, but don't be afraid to throw those around, or just descriptive names like Ivory Princess. While it's not any particular cultural or regional bent to it, it does evoke some imagery. I mean, ivory, we all know that historically ivory has been valuable. We know that a princess is obviously a big deal. Ivory princess wouldn't necessarily need to be a person. The ivory princess might be an item. But when you're developing these names, you're just really laying down the foundation for something interesting to come back to. But by giving it a name that ties into a place, valley, tower, hive, you could just as easily have said ivory princess, but that's more of a hook than a location. By making the Valley of the Ivory Princess, you give it a location. So bringing that now down to hooks, it is important to make sure that while you're coming up with locations, you're also just brainstorming hooks. And hooks are really one of those things I think that people who are coming up as DMs, they want to think that the hook has to always be something really profound. And what they're forgetting is that a lot of players are really going to be responsive to basic stimuli like rescues, searches, stopping things, protecting, defending. These are things that, while they may seem overly simplified, are at the core of the game. Now, you can expand on these by what they're rescuing or what they're protecting, and that often comes down to your locations. But your hooks also don't have to be the entirety of the adventure. So writing down hooks like goblins raid villages, or spiders in the old chapel. There you've got two different locations. In both those hooks, you've got a location, but that hook may not be where and the location that it might nod to may not necessarily be where the adventure takes place. Tying some of the suggestions here. Okay, so goblins are raiding the village. Maybe the goblins are raiding the village because there are sacrifices needed to open up the dread hive of Azkaban. Perhaps or even better, maybe the spiders that have infested the old chapel, maybe that is a sign that the seals that once kept the dread hive closed have now weakened, and the insect, the creepy crawly insectoid monstrosities that were once held within are now free. So those hooks, while they only have to be the hook. They don't have to speak to the entirety of the adventure. When your players are sitting in the inn and the door busts open and somebody screams, there's a werewolf in the town square, and the players go out and fight the werewolf, that is not usually the entirety of the game. Now, it might be if you just need a real quick one night's game, or maybe you decided during some of the characters' downtime activity you'd throw them for a bit of a loop and have an attack. But very often, what you're going to, most of the time, what's going to end up happening from that is that hook of the werewolf is in the village square is going to lead to some development of story that leads to a greater plot. Maybe after they defeat the werewolf, he transforms back to his human form, and it's revealed that he's the kindly farmer, bishop from around the bend. And the adventure really is finding how this kindly farmer came to such horrible state, and now the players and their characters have to go figure out what it is that caused it. So there's your hook. Now that location could lead to something off your list, and this is really why you're making these two lists, because if you have hooks and you have locations, it is very easy to come back and on the fly go, okay, spiders in the chapel, dread hive of Azkaban. But spiders from the chapel could also tie into something else. It doesn't. You don't. I would actually invite you, for the sake of of flexing your DMing muscles, to not think of specific combinations when you're doing this. I mean, sure, if you think of them, by all means, write them off separately and have these two lists be separate but related, but only related in the fact that you plan to use them together down the road. Kidnapped characters or kidnapped NPCs, kidnapped villagers, raids, plagues, diseases. These are all good hooks. Pieces of information that are discovered. Don't sell short the timely, the time-honored use of the mysterious object. The kind of the MacGuffin in the story. If an old merchant comes to town with a strange medallion with an ancient symbol on it, and the players research that symbol and they find out that this is the seal of the Ivory Princess. Next thing you know, your players are on their way looking for the Valley of the Ivory Princess and the renowned treasure there. But on the same token, it could be that there's a mysterious plague that's covering the land. Where's the secret? Well, it might be thought where's the secret cure? Well, is it in the library? No, we can't find it. The only thing we can find any reference to this particular plague in the library indicates that it was tied into this item, and the last recorded reference of that item that the players need, a manuscript or whatever it is, a scroll that gives this cure, or maybe the cure itself. Maybe it's only ever existed in physical form a few times, and the last known sample of this, maybe there's not even a formula for it. Making it even more important is maybe it's in the treasure trove in the Valley of the Ivory Princess. So it could be that they're again, you're looking at combinations. In the first one, they're finding out about the Valley of the Ivory Princess to go get it just for loot. What adventure happens when they get there, that's up to the actual specifics of the adventure. But on the other hand, now to save the land, the kingdom, village, whatever, they have to go to the Valley of the Ivory Princess for this cure, whatever it is. That cure could also just as easily be in the Tower of Kossus. That cure could be in the Dread Hive of Azkaban. That it could be anywhere, any of your locations of your list. But if you have the hook of plague across the land, and then you have a location, then you can sew those things together with the wheel. What is in the location that will help here? And then that leads, A leads to B, leads to C. But really, what you're getting with your locations and your threat and your hooks is your A. That's really both parts that are going to make your A. That's your why and where. And so those come together. So how I'm trying to keep this video to about a half an hour or so, but how can you use these outside of just creating adventures? Well, you can use them as seeds. Locations make for good adventure seeds. Have a map be found as part of the treasure pointing to the Valley of the Ivory Princess. Have a book that is a single volume from a greater library that's found in the Tower of Kossus. So world building, this will help actually with world building too, because as you're creating locations, you're creating a mental map of the history and the background and the flavor of your setting. You may already have a very well developed map, but these locations can be sunk in there and peppered around into the corners or even in the middle of your campaign setting. So while it's not on the map, the Tower of Kossus could really very much be in the middle of one of your more civilized areas. It's just nobody goes there. It's this folkloric thing. Maybe it's got some heavy, mystique over it where nobody dares to go to it. And while it may be really easy to ask yourself, well, why hasn't any adventurer in the history of the game of the game world ever gone there and done that? Well, maybe they have and they failed, which has built the mystery, built the mystery of the place. But also, that's kind of the game. It's really easy to get wrapped up in why hasn't anybody ever done this. But if everybody had already done everything that was to be, we wouldn't be playing D&D. The whole point of playing D&D is that your party, your players, are the ones going out and doing this. Now they may ask, and it's very likely that you're going to have a character who's going to inquire of an NPC, why hasn't this happened? It's easy to just hand wave that. They have and they failed. People are too afraid to go there. Those simple answers will build the mystique in your players' minds too. So it'll actually either, when they go there, they'll be expecting something horrible, and so you have an excuse to really deliver on that if you like to play off the players' fears and hopes and dreams, or it will inspire their heroic tendencies. If you're playing with a much more heroic group, well, nobody else has ever done this, and it's a horrible place. We need to go there and check it out. So, something I said earlier in the video that I want to touch on briefly here is having layers to your campaign setting makes it a lot easier to pepper in these locations. If you have already established that there is the present day, and then there's the empire before, and maybe even the empire before that, you have every excuse to layer things throughout the world. In fact, sometimes you can even layer them on top of things. Maybe the capital city that everybody's been hanging out in your campaign setting, maybe that capital is built on top of one of these other locations you've developed. So you have an excuse at any point to sink a dungeon. Excuse me. You have an excuse at any point to sink a dungeon anywhere where there's already been people traveling, or in the middle of a civilized area, based on the fact that you have already established that there is an ancient history to your world, that there are layers. Giving those places and those periods names will help the players reference them. For example, in my setting, my Aerolith campaign that I'm running, we have the present day vassalry of Aerolith. But before that, there was the High Kingdom of Aerolith. And the High Kingdom of Aerolith had existed since the fall of the Threndian Empire. The Threndian Empire had been in existence for quite some time before that. It's kind of going back to almost like a mythic age. And at the same time, there are remnants of the Threndian Empire in the campaign setting. Off to the east of Aerolith is a kingdom called Vendia. Vendia still styles itself after the ancient Threndian Empire, whereas Aerolith had become a little bit more modern. At the same time, there are other locations in my setting that have a slightly different history, but they also have layers of history. Bakara, which is the northern kind of, in my campaign it's all sub-equatorial, so north gets warmer. So Bakara is very warm environment, very mixed between jungles and deserts and kind of Serengeti plains type of thing. There have been layers of culture there before us as well. There's the Sea of Zavir, and around the Sea of Zavir are the Vizaki people. And the Vizaki people once lived in a kingdom that stretched far to the east into what is now a desert, but now they don't. So, who knows what's in that desert? That desert predates the current culture. Anyways, that was the last little bit on how to help those locations build your world, and how your world can help you with the locations. But remember, place to put your notes, keep a list of locations and hooks, and remember to give your locations and your hooks a little bit of flavor. Simple names doesn't usually do it down the road. I mean, they can, but try to add a few sentences of description to each of those, and when you're coming back to those ideas in a month or so, it'll make a lot more sense. Anyways, this is Eli from Elfbait. Thanks for tuning in. If you have any questions, any ideas, comments, leave them down below. How do you guys come up with hooks and locations, what is your process? Any particular helpful tips that you want to share with myself and the rest of the folks watching the videos? Feel free and get out and game. Take care.